Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our final Water UCI colloquium of the year. We're going to give it about a minute or so for people to check in, sign in, and then I will introduce our speaker, Gregory Pierce from UCLA. So welcome, everyone. All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Dave Feldman. I'm the Director of Water UCI. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to our final Water UCI colloquium for this academic year. We have a full slate of new programs in the fall. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Professor Gregory Pierce, who is the Associate Director of the Luskin Center for Innovation and a faculty member in the Department of Urban Planning, and also the co-director of the UCLA Water Resources Faculty Group. Since joining the Luskin Center in 2015, Greg has been instrumental in guiding the center's leadership to inform the human right to water policy in California, a topic, in fact, that he will be touching upon this morning. And his work has also taken him across the United States in terms of research. He's authored 35 peer-reviewed journal articles and numerous major research reports, including many with California and state and local water agencies. And his broader research interests lie at the intersection of public finance, infrastructure planning, and environmental justice. Greg holds a PhD in urban planning from UCLA. His talk is entitled Quantifying Drinking Water Quality Risk and Solutions in California, a statewide assessment. Just a couple of logistical notes. There is a Q&A function in the webinar today. If you have questions that you would like to have submitted after Greg makes his remarks, please do put your question in there. We should have time for a number of questions. This seminar will end promptly at 1 p.m. And then the last thing I want to say before taking it away to Greg is it's a great pleasure and privilege to have him speak, especially since we have worked together on a couple of projects in recent years. And it's just great to hear about your work. Greg, it's all yours.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks to everyone for having me and for joining this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And I believe, let me know if you're not seeing it, but I'm assuming you are. And yeah, my talk today is going to focus particularly on an effort that we at UCLA were involved in with the California State Water Board, which is really a landmark assessment of drinking water quality risk and solutions across the state. But I'm going to try to contextualize my comments and what I present in sort of the broader research to policy efforts around human right to water in California, as well as that we're undertaking at the Luskin Center. And I am also going to try to be fairly brief, talk for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then have plenty of time for Q&A. So first, I want to just briefly say at the Luskin Center, we really have two tracks of work in the water space. The first, and the one, of course, we'll be emphasizing today, is research to support policy, very locally to globally on human right to water implementation. The other track of research is around moving, particularly the Southern California region, toward local water resiliency, away from such dependence on imported water, which I know is also a big focus in Orange County. I'm going to use the term human right to water a lot in this presentation, and there are different definitions of what the human right to water means, again, globally. And the US is not a party to any global declaration of the human right to water. But the functional definition I'm using here comes from California law, because we do have a legislated human right to water in California since 2012. And it says essentially that every human being has the right to safe and clean, or high quality, affordable, and accessible water. And we've done a lot of work, as I just mentioned, but particularly with the state of California, with the State Water Board, which has sort of the oversight or regulatory authority over drinking water systems in the state, particularly for quality, but also increasingly for affordability and accessibility. We've done a lot of work with the state board and with local regional agencies, as well as community groups, around the quality and affordability of water, again, both within Los Angeles and more broadly across California. Here's just a snapshot of some of the recent work we've done. And I particularly want to note some of the work that we've been doing on affordability, because it's of interest, I think, I hope it's of interest to this audience. And there have been some very recent developments at the state level, particularly in a focus on shutoff prevention, utility service shutoff prevention, and debt relief for customers who can't pay their water bills. We've been working with the state, or we did work with the state for about 4 to 5 years on a statewide plan for low-income water rate assistance, or essentially affordability assistance to customers who couldn't pay their water bills. And more recently, we have been involved collaborating with the board on estimates of water-related debt. And this, in the governor's revised budget that just came out last week, there is a proposed $1 billion of debt relief for water customers in the state. And we also do work in addition, I should say, in addition to work that directly informs policy, we do undertake sort of more conceptual and broader research that goes into peer-reviewed publications. And again, affordability solutions research is a big focus of our work. But with that being said, I do want to focus in particular the rest of my presentation on the statewide needs assessment that we worked on and that was recently completed. And there is literally a 500-page report released on the State Water Board's website with several sources of publicly available data and actually a raft of draft white papers and previous public presentations that are accessible if you'd like more details on the effort. There's a lot to say about sort of the structure of the inaugural State Water Board needs assessment. I can't say it all here, but I do want to emphasize, and you may have seen on the introductory slide, this was very much a team effort. I was the principal investigator of the sort of funded research that partners undertook with the State Water Board, but I believe there were 31 named authors of the report. And there were actually many more people, many more agencies and partners involved in the broader effort to bring this about. But particularly in terms of the research we were funded to do with the State Water Board, that was again housed and sort of led by UCLA, but we partnered in turn with 4 different groups that are named as collaboration partners on the slide, with Corona Environmental Consulting, with the Pacific Institute, and with the Environmental Finance Centers at University of North Carolina and Sacramento State. And I'll try to call out different pieces of the work that I present and where those pieces were led by partners. But this research was also, it was not just a UCLA effort, it is in fact owned by the California Water Board, led by the California Water Board, and particularly by a unit that was actually created through a funding mechanism passed by the California legislature in 2019. A new needs assessment unit was created in the last 2 years to undertake this work in partnership with us, and then to take the work going forward and do it on an annual basis. So I should say, actually, as a disclaimer here, that we undertook this initial round of work that you'll see on drinking water quality and affordability needs assessment across the state. But I do not speak on behalf of the Water Board. We are not currently formally working with the Water Board on this. And so my remarks here, although many of them are directly based on that work, don't represent the Water Board officially. But the premise of the needs assessment essentially was to go beyond the obligations that the State Water Board has as the regulator of drinking water systems across California, to comply primarily with the Safe Drinking Water Act and some of additional state level standards. And the Safe Drinking Water Act is a national piece of legislation. Every state has an agency that works to ensure compliance of drinking water systems, to basically make sure that water quality is up to standard and safe and clean for all the residents in a given state. But the needs assessment in California was aimed essentially both to identify a broader definition of how water systems might be failing beyond that act, to also assess it, and something I'm going to focus on here, to try to assess where systems haven't yet failed but are likely to fail or at risk of failure, and then very importantly to focus on the solutions for systems that both have failed and are at risk of failing, and the cost of funding solutions so to prevent failure and to make systems sustainable to provide safe and affordable water going forward. Currently, to give you a sense of how many systems are deemed failing in California, there's about 331, although these numbers change every day, out of about 7,000 systems total. And another aspect of the needs assessment was a focus particularly on small water systems serving 3,300 connections or fewer, because a lot of the water quality violations or failures to meet the regulatory standards are concentrated in small water systems. And it may be familiar to some of you, but not to others, that a lot of the sort of failures and disparities in human right to water sort of realization for residents of California. But again, this is something that's true globally. It's something that's true in Los Angeles, which is illustrated here. It is a reflection of the fragmentation of the water system landscape. Essentially, unlike what you see in other utility sectors, namely in energy or telecom, or even in wastewater, there are just a variety of drinking water systems and populations not served by drinking water systems. And each of these different types of systems has vastly different capacities and intent to sort of serve their customers in a fully satisfactory manner. You just have a number of systems. Again, I said there's 7,000 water systems in California. And even in a place like Los Angeles, you have 200 systems ranging literally from a mobile home park serving 25 people to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power serving 4 million people. I will note, and it's been something we've researched before, Orange County is actually a little bit different in that it has fewer systems. They tend to be large and just tend to be much more organized and high performing on many of these dimensions than some of the parallel counties in California. As I said, the needs assessment is a novel effort on a number of respects, but in particular, because again, it looks to go beyond just identification of systems that are not complying with existing regulations that are sort of national or state level standards, but also to look at where water systems are at risk of failing, and also, very importantly, to include folks who are not served by regulated water systems, who are in turn served by domestic wells or what are called state small systems, and include them in the analysis of water quality risk and failure, and to try to fund solutions to meet their needs as well. And you can see here sort of a pyramid of prioritization of the SAFER program, which is funded by the piece of legislation I mentioned, and to which the needs assessment is essentially informing a spending plan with the monies it has available. As I just mentioned, the SAFER program and the whole needs assessment effort is really nested within this new unit within the State Water Board. that was authorized and funded and now mandated by Senate Bill 200, which was passed in 2019, which establishes the safe and affordable funding for Equity and Resilience Program, or SAFER, which is an acronym you'll see throughout this presentation. And the SAFER unit, the SAFER program, the short story is does a lot more than just this annual needs assessment. Again, most of its work is really focused on providing solutions to meet needs, not just identifying needs. That being said, the needs assessment, which we helped with or collaborated with, has 3 core components. Again, there are literally 500 pages of detail in the final report that were released in April, in addition to more detail in past white papers leading up to the final report, and a lot of publicly available data that you can download right now, and you can go to the Water Board's website right now and access. And there are multiple sort of subcomponents within these components, but I'm primarily going to focus the rest of my remarks on the risk assessment for public water systems, as well as the cost and sort of solutions assessment for cost. That was the focus of our analysis. I'm not going to talk so much about the affordability assessment, although I'm happy to do so in Q&A. So the risk analysis, again, there are actually two pieces to the risk analysis. One is focused on public water systems. The other was focused on domestic wells. I'm just going to mention the domestic wells piece at the end and really focus on the public water system piece. Because we at UCLA led the public water system piece in conjunction with the Water Board, but also it's more of a sort of complex and novel methodology in terms of analyzing risk. And the goal with analyzing risk, again, in this case, was really to predict where water systems that hadn't currently failed to exceed water quality standards or to fail to meet water quality standards were likely to do so, and then with the identification of risk, to prevent those systems from doing so through providing funding, technical assistance, et cetera, from the Water Board side. And I'm just going to run briefly first through sort of the methodology for the risk assessment for public water systems. But essentially, we took an original list, identified list of 129 potential risk indicators, narrowed that down to 19 risk indicators, or sort of metrics, data points, in 4 categories: affordability, accessibility, water quality. Again, those are the 3 components of the human right to water, as well as technical, managerial, financial capacity, or TMF, as you see the acronym here. For each of the indicators that were ultimately used in the inaugural risk assessment methodology, didn't have to just identify the indicator, but also determine how to measure the indicator, what the threshold or thresholds of concern would be, and then how to combine the indicators into a score or designation to label systems as not at risk, potentially at risk, or at risk, which you'll see the results of in just a few minutes. But essentially, the methodology of the scoring was undertaken through a weighted indice approach, which I'll show you a little bit of in just a minute. But in the first risk assessment, as was mentioned, 19 risk indicators were really selected from 129 proposed indicators. A lot of indicators that dropped out were not usable, were due to data quality and data availability concerns. Since this is an assessment that was undertaken of all water systems with 3,300 connections or fewer, they had 2,800 systems, and because this process is going to be owned by a state agency, data had to be publicly available or accessible to the agency. Anything that didn't have data, for the vast majority of systems simply couldn't be used. But what we wound up with in the first round was 6 different indicators of water quality risk, 5 different indicators of water accessibility risk, 3 different indicators of water affordability risk, and 5 indicators of TMF capacity risk. And I will say, there's some imbalance between the different categories. Some of that is intentional, given the assumptions and sort of past evidence around what drives water quality failure for a water system, but there is already an explicit effort, intention of the Water Board to improve and expand its list of affordability indicators and financial capacity indicators for this assessment going forward. And I do want to call out, it's shown on the previous slide, that there was explicit and sort of direct coordination with two other agencies in the state who also work on the human right to water, and from which there are complementary data and risk assessment efforts. And there is publicly available data if you're a researcher or a student or just interested, that's very accessible, you can play around with, or you can use to look at water system risk in different ways. One source is from OWIHA's Human Right to Water tool. The other source is from the Department of Water Resources Drought and Water Shortage tool. And those data were used in part in the Water Board assessment, but also stand on their own as assessments of risk and water system performance. That, compared to 2 or 3 years ago, these tools both just came out. There's just a wealth of information and data to assess water system performance in the state. I'm not going to go too much into the actual calculation of risk, but essentially, as I said, the methodology was a weighted index where each indicator received a normalized value score. Each indicator also had a weight, and then categories were assigned a weight as well. And the aggregated risk assessment score for each system was essentially a reflection of the indicator score and its weight, and category score and their weights, as you can see on this slide. What did the results look like? I think the first thing to note is that in terms of the risk assessment really being an early warning system, as it was designed, it was important not to sort of designate systems as at risk too easily. And so the methodology that was used actually shows that all at-risk systems exceeded sort of a warning sign or a threshold of concern for at least 4 risk indicators. It wasn't the case that if you failed on one of these indicators or had a red light on one of these indicators that you were automatically at risk. Typically, systems had actually 6 or more risk indicator that were of concern for them to land on the at-risk list. And the results among the nearly 2,800 systems that were analyzed were essentially, as you see here, across the state, with there being just over 300 or 326 at the time, systems that were already failing, or a little bit confusing, but what the Water Board used to call the Human Right to Water list, but that's the failing number, 326 systems out of the 2,800. And then about 25% were scored as at risk, using the methodology that I described just previously. And then 23%, I believe, or 552 systems were designated as potentially at risk, and about half or just over half were scored as not at risk using this methodology. Something that's really important to note, and maybe obvious to many of you, is that the results of the risk assessment, and really any analysis you do of sort of human right to water realization across the state, are uneven across the state. If you look at the 58 counties across the state, you see quite a bit of variation in system performance. And what stands out here has stood out in previous analyses of the human right to water is that there are a lot more systems that are both failing and at risk within the San Joaquin Valley. At the same time, not nearly, I mean, there are plenty of systems in plenty of other regions of concern, particularly along the Central Coast, and the results of this analysis would also suggest in many of the urbanized counties of Southern California, although again, Orange County is an exception here, you can see it nearly all the way on the far left-hand side with very few systems scored at risk compared to its neighbors in Los Angeles, San Bernardino, Riverside. And again, something I want to emphasize is that all of the data I just showed you, both in raw and sort of process form, is available right now for you to download if you want to play around with it or analyze it. And this data will be updated periodically. I believe it's already been updated from what was released in the report. So it will be a continuously updated product over time for public access. And alongside that, something I mentioned at the beginning in terms of risk, there was a parallel risk assessment of water quality for those who are reliant on wells or small water systems, essentially those who are not reliant on publicly regulated systems. This was undertaken led by the groundwater assessment team at the Water Board. The data are again publicly available. You can access them right now. And there are several parallel efforts to this assessing groundwater quality undertaken by the Department of Water Resources, as well as a team out of Berkeley called the Water Equity Science Shop. That brings us to solutions and the cost of solutions. And I'm going to run through this a little more quickly. But again, the needs assessment was really novel in its focus, not just on risks and on problems, but also on how those problems can be fixed, how much it would cost to solve those problems, as well as where the money could or should come from to solve those problems. And again, there's a lot of detail on sort of determination of cost of solutions, with there being actually 3 different tracks of solution types: solutions for public water systems that had clearly failed, solutions for at-risk systems, and then solutions for at-risk wells, as well as both long-term and short-term sort of solution types for each. And this is a diagram from page 235 of the report that shows you some of the complexity. Again, all the details are available online. I should also note this effort, the cost assessment effort, was really led by Corona Environmental Consulting in conjunction with the Environmental Finance Center at Sacramento State, and with support from the Pacific Institute, particularly on the funding solutions piece. And if you're asking the question, what do we mean by solutions? Here's an abbreviated list of the type of solutions that were considered. Again, these are for the human right to water list, or the failing system list, with the sort of traditional way of looking at solutions that are funded by traditional infrastructure financing programs, such as the State Revolving Fund, Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, being an emphasis on centralized treatment. One of the emphases that the state more broadly has in the last few years, and certainly the needs assessment is on the potential for consolidation or the physical integration of systems. So I'll show you a few slides on that in just a second. But the range of solutions that were considered were essentially anywhere between physical consolidation on one end of systems or wells into systems, to point of use, point of entry, which are sort of at the tap filters, and everything in between. Physical consolidation was modeled, again, across the state using publicly available data, and essentially was analyzed. The cost of it was analyzed in every circumstance where there was a system that was failing or at risk of failing, and then another system that was not failing within 3 miles proximity along sort of the road network. The 3-mile buffer was deemed to be, and it's been established in previous research, as sort of the maximum distance with currently available technology and cost that physical consolidation is cost feasible. And this is a map showing you essentially where physical consolidation was judged to be a potential solution for systems that were failing or at risk. Something I do want to note is that there was an assessment, or an estimation, I should say, of the potential cost savings of regional approaches as opposed to one-to-one consolidations. Only the one-to-one consolidations cost estimates were included in the aggregated cost estimate because the regionalization approaches would require institutional changes, governance changes that might be desirable, but that the state can't currently assume are feasible which is something I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A if it's of interest. Another thing I want to emphasize is even though there is an emphasis on consolidation, and consolidation was in many cases judged to be the most sustainable solution, physical consolidation is by no means feasible for every system that's failing, every system that's at risk, or the population that are reliant on domestic wells. You can see that, hopefully you can see that in the physical consolidation column here. You actually see that less than 50% of each of these sort of in need system or population types were assessed as sort of physical consolidation being the best option for them on a cost and sustainability basis. Although again, that could change, those numbers could go up, would go up if we could consider regional solutions as a primary option. And again, no surprise, since the risks are different, that the costs are different, and the distribution of failing systems is different. But this is just showing you the range of capital costs or one-time sort of infrastructure costs for long-term solutions, county by county in the state. Again, with San Joaquin Valley counties taking up the bulk of the overall cost, even though they're much fewer in terms of the 58 counties. Another thing to say here is that you can see there's both point estimates of cost and quite large ranges of cost, or estimation ranges. Those were based on class 5 engineering estimates that do have large degrees of error in them. Those are the best that can be produced, sort of at industry standard. But the hope is that as more solutions are funded over time, those cost estimates can be refined and made more precise to recognize the true sort of funding need. One other thing I want to mention before really briefly talking about where the money for this would or could come from is that there was an assessment, although the emphasis was on long-term solutions and their costs, there was an assessment of, essentially of the cost of providing emergency water while long-term solutions were being affected for all the populations that have been described. The interim solutions that were looked at were either bottled water or point of use, point of entry, or other sorts of water delivery mechanisms. The main thing I want to say here is that the cost of providing interim solutions is really large on a per gallon basis. And it really, I think, motivates putting the money in investing up front in long-term solutions to save money on providing interim solutions, particularly bottled water, which essentially dry up fast because it costs the state over $1 per gallon to provide that resource. Last but not least, funding gap analysis. Again, this is quite a novel exercise and something that I think is really relevant to other states, although California has more sources of funding for the human right to water than I believe any other state. But as other states pass their own funding measures, as there's hopefully more funding from the federal government for these types of programs, one has to do an accounting of exactly how and where the money should come from with a state's existing resources. And that's essentially what was done here. I'm not going to go into the details, but there was an exhaustive accounting of essentially which particular fund, whether it be, again, state revolving fund, proposition monies, this new SAFER program monies, should go to pay each different type of need. And each of those funding programs has different rules about who's eligible and what can be funded. A lot of programs, it's easier to fund capital, but harder to fund operations and maintenance, which is something the SAFER fund explicitly can do. So there was a detailed analysis of all of that in both sort of a 1 and 5 year time frame looking forward. Cutting to the chase on this, essentially a gap over and above the funds that the state currently had, or had at least as of a few weeks ago, was identified at $4.6 billion. That also takes into account or assumes that local communities would contribute funding to these solutions through local cost share. But the gap that was identified after all of that was accounted for was approximately $4.6 billion. Although we've already seen in the governor's budget, a potentially $800 to $900 million additional allocation to meet some of these needs over and above what was expected. So that could potentially reduce the gap immediately below $4 billion. As I've said, or as I mentioned at the outset, the needs assessment, this was the inaugural needs assessment, and it was a two-plus year effort in order to do that. But the needs assessment actually will be undertaken by the State Water Board on an annual basis for at least the next decade, but likely beyond. And there is already efforts underway to improve and expand the data, both on the risk and the cost side, to refine estimates. And there is a robust public engagement process. There are already webinars and sort of data collection efforts undergoing that you can check out on the State Water Board's website and be involved in this effort going forward. Last but not least, I do want to briefly just mention a few other, I think, human right to water research to policy efforts that complement the needs assessment but go beyond it that we're interested in. And I just want to mention as necessary. The first is really a parallel effort. There's been a lot of focus on drinking water quality and affordability at the state level, pretty robust estimates on need and on solutions. There hasn't been quite as much emphasis or sort of program development on the accessibility front. And as we have already entered into a drought and already seeing places in the state literally running out of water, I think that's an urgent need. And I know an effort that some folks are working on, but I think has to be elevated and done quickly and robustly to truly realize the human right to water. And then I'll just mention, since I'm at least speaking to I'm assuming mostly folks in Orange County, that I think there's a really interesting and important set of research and policy that needs to be undertaken to ensure that we have a just transition for urban water, as in counties, certainly like Orange County and Los Angeles, but pretty much all the urbanized counties of California look to and have moved away from as much of reliance on imported water toward local and regional solutions like recycled water, enhanced stormwater to groundwater capture, or controversially desalination, that those transitions are made equitably, and particularly that their affordability considerations are undertaken for that and those transitions, as well as trying to bring in some of these smaller systems and even private wells into the fold as those transitions are made, rather than keep the status quo of unequal access, affordability, and quality that we do see in many parts of the state. With that, I'm going to conclude and thank you all for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Greg. That was great. Really informative talk. I see that we have a question in our Q&A related to your talk. One of our participants asked how saving water in California, given our drought, given our chronic dryness, fits into this issue of equity and infrastructure and water access.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it certainly fits in the broader picture of equity, both, in a number of dimensions. I would say it wasn't as explicitly addressed, except around access to water that water systems have in this assessment, but more broadly, conservation, I think, can both improve equity and respond to sort of inequities in access through progressive pricing structures and through the offering and ensuring that conservation assistance is just as accessible to those who don't have large sums of money to invest up front, and for instance, turf replacement or lawn replacement programs, as others. But generally, yeah, I think there's more work to be done in that space, and that's part of the future research of the ongoing research that we've begun to do that I mentioned as the first bullet in the last slide.
Very good, thank you. Another attendee had a more technical question regarding one of the principles that you addressed in your talk, and that was MCL, what that stands for and what its significance is for this problem.
Yeah, great question. I'm sorry, I didn't clarify that. MCL stands for maximum contaminant level. And the Safe Drinking Water Act, which is the national legislation regarding drinking water quality, for each contaminant of concern, which I believe there's 98 or so, that every water system has to comply with, they have to stay below the MCL or they receive a violation. Basically, they have a clear water quality problem they're obligated to fix. There's a lot more nuance there, but essentially MCL is the drinking water quality standards every water system has to comply with per national and state standards.
All right, thank you. Another question related to contaminants is contaminants of emerging concern. What about the PFAS issue?
I think I just sighed because that is a big question, and it was something I had in the last slide as well, but I didn't cover. These estimates, I will say, do not cover, they did not include the cost of treating PFAS, PFOA, or hexavalent chromium, which are two sets of contaminants that are of concern, including in urban areas. A lot of water systems, if there were standards set now that systems had to comply with, would be out of compliance, would be failing per this definition. So it's a concern I know the state is working on and will be providing funding assistance for. But that's why I put in the previous slide, I think there also has to be one area which I'm not particularly well suited to do the primary research on, is we really need to find technologies that are scalable to lower the cost of treatment for emerging contaminants, or a lot of systems are going to be priced out of treatment technologies and then either be unable to implement them or implement them, but the cost of water is going to skyrocket and become unaffordable for their customers. So that's a big one. It's not addressed here because the standards are not currently enforced. The state can't do that yet in an effort like this, although it is also working on in the effort and certainly knows the standards are coming. So I hope that answers the question in part.
Okay, very good. We have another question, lengthy question. I'm going to go ahead and read it. It also relates to water pricing, not to contaminants, but to water pricing per se. And the question is, what would be an example of equitable water distribution to alleviate stress on imported water? Given that water access is not equitable due to different payment tiers, depending on the water district in which one lives, middle class and higher income people have significantly more, I assume also better access to water. Because of this, with no real limits on water use. And then a question goes on, even during the height of the drought, the previous drought some years ago, upper income people were still able to pay their way through the drought, while, for instance, many had to shower with a bucket. How do you see this handled properly in the future?
Yeah, so a big question, a lot going on there. I think important questions. I guess I'll give a few thoughts, and Dave, if you want to jump in, welcome your thoughts as well. But I guess the first is that I do think pricing, if water systems are able to implement sort of progressively tiered pricing, that can go a long way toward equity. If a basic level of consumption, sort of the first tier, is made very cheap for everyone to consume, and then there's progressively higher prices applied to higher levels of consumption, that has been shown repeatedly to be to go some way toward meeting equity needs. Although there's also a caveat there that some water systems are, it's made more difficult for them to do so because of Proposition 218. I guess more broadly, I think a lot of the issues with the inequities you're seeing are across water systems, and so then there's no ability of a system, unless those systems become consolidated, to meet the needs of someone who's outside their jurisdiction. And so you see a lot of folks who are, for instance, needing to use buckets of water or served by small underperforming systems that probably aren't going to be able to implement an equitable pricing scheme in general. Then I guess my final comment would be, I think, in response to the notion of sanctions or sort of prohibitions on really high levels of water use. I do think, I mean, there was no explicit state mandate on that, although there were standards that water systems had to comply with in terms of how much water was used. And systems have discretion to apply sort of mandates or sanctions on residents or customers, but generally other types of approaches were favored and were found to be fairly effective. And I think we'll see as we progress, I mean, hopefully it rains a lot soon, but if we progress into this next drought, I think you'll see more sanctions, more punitive measures, but generally that's sort of the last resort, because we don't want to be unduly restrictive on people using a basic resource, and it gets really messy if we do so.
Well, you alluded to Prop 218 and how it plays into this, and we actually have a question in the Q&A on what mechanisms might be considered to motivate physical consolidation in the presence of Prop 218 requirements. Would you care to comment, Greg?
Sure. I'm trying to think of Prop 218 physical consolidation. I mean, again, I think physical consolidation, or even, I should say there's non-physical consolidation. There's sort of administrative consolidation opens up the opportunity to see less inequities in pricing, among other things, across systems than you see existing, but I'm not sure how Prop 218 fits into that equation. It doesn't really prohibit or limit consolidation as far as I know. Right. But I would say, especially in the presence of Prop 218, the more normalization or sort of equal treatment we can give to customers, which certainly is facilitated by consolidation, the better. Is until or unless Prop 218 is overturned, there's an inherent inequity in how much systems can do for their customers, both in terms of affordability and sort of conservation.
And I suppose implicit too in what you're saying is the ability under Prop 218 to really control what constitutes essential water uses, as
Right.
opposed to what might be considered less essential or non-essential water
Right.
uses. Okay, well, thank you for that. Very thoughtful answer. We have another question in the chat regarding the use of your study for political change. Would you foresee that environmental justice groups could use your findings for actually helping compel change, or will change and funding changes likely come at the state level regardless?
Well, I'm going to go with the classic both and I should have said, or I'm happy to say now, the human right to water legislation that was passed in 2012, as well as the funding, the SAFER program, SB 200 in 2019, and thus the needs assessment, all would not have happened without the advocacy of environmental justice organizations. Environmental justice organizations are very active in this space in helping get legislation considered and passed, and working with agencies on efforts such as the needs assessment. They were involved in the needs assessment. There's also a an advisory board to the SAFER program that's primarily constituted of water system agency members as well as environmental justice organization members and community members. So they're instrumental to everything. And I think are instrumental even to things like I mentioned, the governor's enhanced budget to address both water quality and affordability. I would, as a multi-stakeholder effort, I'm sure, but it wouldn't have been possible without the leadership of environmental justice organizations.
So there really is a commitment at the state level currently to make some changes. And so the congruence between your study and the political climate may be very opportune. It's very heartening to learn. I'm going to go ahead and take the chair's privilege, co-host privilege, and ask my own question. Greg, toward the end of your presentation, you talked about different water innovations and the need to make sure that there's some process for incorporating public input, questions of social equity, and the adoption of these innovations, whether it be, you alluded to wastewater recycling, and you also mentioned desalination, which is obviously an issue of some continuing, let's say, contention in our region. What sorts of mechanisms would your study and would your research generally prescribe in terms of having a truly efficacious public engagement process in terms of looking at the adoption of these innovations from a social justice standpoint?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And yeah, happy to answer. I would say, this goes beyond sort of the needs assessment. I'm certainly not speaking for the water board here, but in my own view, there's really at least three different components or strategies under which regional new water investments, especially large ones, can be more equitable. And I will say it won't happen by default, so there needs to be active effort in this space. The first and broadest would be to see more community members, more diverse set of community members involved, like actually leading the efforts of agencies, being on the boards of agencies, representing the community in a more diverse way, as opposed to even just participating in public venues at public meetings. I mean, that's great, but actually sort of leading the effort would be fantastic. The second and third are sort of strategies that we did outline in a recent report that evaluated the likely affordability impact of the desalination plant proposed in Huntington Beach. So you can check out that report for more of those details. But essentially, there's two different things there. The first is that these new configurations or investments, to me, are a golden opportunity, if people see them that way, to integrate more of these small water systems or people who are not served by water systems into the fold, because there's huge investments being made, new pipelines, new institutional arrangements. Let's bring in the small systems who aren't currently so plugged in to broader regional efforts, don't have diverse water sources. Let's bring them in explicitly. Let's make those part of those efforts through consolidation or just new regional agreements that really take account of these small, relatively neglected populations. But the final and most sort of instrumental approach would be simply to make sure that these large investments are not passed through in terms of their cost, who pays for them, as fixed charges on water customers' bills, that they're applied in a progressive way, sort of on higher tiers of consumption, or that customers who aren't using more water as a result of these arrangements have the opportunity to consume a modest amount of water and not pay exorbitantly more for their water, because the cost of those investments was simply passed through as a fixed charge on a customer's bill. So those are my three off the top of my head thoughts on that topic.
Great. And I'm glad this is recorded because this will be some great observations for posterity. I have another question, Greg, that alludes to something that you mentioned earlier in your talk about the relative health of Orange County water agencies, being, as I think you phrased it, large and pretty robust in terms of their resources. To your knowledge, do we have any small water agencies in Orange County that might be subject to the kinds of challenges that you've been discussing?
Yeah, we do, and I can't remember off the top of my head how many there are. There are certainly a few, but I think it would be, less than 5, certainly less than 10 agencies or small systems that would be of concern. I'm happy to provide more details if someone wants to follow up, but it's relatively less of a concern, the small systems, underperforming small systems on the quality and accessibility front in Orange County than elsewhere. And that's just something I like to say wherever I go, because it is unique, I would say.
It's great. And your email address is available so people can follow up on that, including anything regarding your recent report. Greg, I want to end with a broad question that I think is definitely germane to the topic that you presented today. We're all hopeful that the Congress might pass some sort of infrastructure bill this year. We know that water is already being discussed as an integral part of what would be contained in that bill. If you had the opportunity to address the Biden administration or Congress on how to implement infrastructure reforms in water regarding or in reference to what you found in your study, what 1 or 2 takeaways might you want to share with decision makers?
Yeah, great question. And I think I didn't note, but until recently, or until now, the share of federal contribution to drinking water infrastructure has plummeted precipitously since, say, 1970. I think it was 40% of spending to now being 5%. So there's a great need. In terms of what I would emphasize to the Biden administration, I think I'd say, first, it's great you're working on this, but I think there's been a large focus on lead, which is absolutely needed, and it's a huge problem, particularly in other areas outside of California. It's a problem here, but not nearly as big of a problem. So let's go beyond lead would be the first thing, or at least let states like California, use their money for other issues that are more pressing. The second would be certainly let's advance or prioritize funding for regional solutions, given the cost savings we can see there, and not simply allocate money for one-off capital investments in systems that frankly any level of investment may not work for them because of the managerial considerations. And the final would be, I think, let's be realistic and let's be really innovative on what we can do for populations that will never be able to be consolidated, particularly the well owner population, which aren't under regulations, the government is not mandated to provide water service to them. But on the point of use, point of entry filter side, let's try to really learn from other parts of the world as well on what we can do there and support that. And make sure that the human right to water is really a right for all across the country.
Great place to close. Greg, thank you. We're just about out of time. I want to take this opportunity to thank Greg Pierce for a wonderful presentation. We'll have to have you back in the future, Greg, talk about your additional research. And also want to thank all of our audience for participating today, taking time out of your schedules. To the School of Social Ecology for all of their support in our colloquium series this year and every year. And lastly, to the Associate Director of Water UCI, Shannon Roback, for being instrumental in helping organize this particular colloquium. Great job, everyone, and have a great summer, everyone. We'll see you in the fall. Take care.
Thanks.